Hi Golf, it's Nick here for Nick Taylor Golf. It's Friday, so welcome to another lesson on golf tips. This week on golf tips, we're going to take a look at the difference between a 7-iron and a wedge using the stack and tilt system. We're going to talk through the differences between the setup and the swing between these two golf clubs. It's a popular question on my channel. What do I do differently with the wedge? So hopefully today's video is going to cover those important things to help you golfers out there play better golf. First up, we're going to take a look at the differences in the club data. So I'm going to hit my 7-iron shot here. This is my standard swing with a 7-iron. Then we're going to move on and hit the wedge. So you can see the shot on the screen there. That's a pretty typical shot. Starts just to the right of the line, just slight draw, pitched around 160 yards. So this with the 7-iron here, you can see my swing path's 4 degrees into out, 4 degrees downwards. Swing path around 90 miles an hour, launch around 20, so pretty standard shot there with my 7-iron. For my wedge here, I've just got a 54-degree wedge, and I'm just going to do a normal kind of full swing. So before we take a look at the differences that's set up in the swing, I'm just going to take a look at that club data. So we saw there with the 7, I was around 4 degrees down, 4 degrees into out. So let's see what happens with the wedge. So you can see the flight on the screen there. Pretty straight, just a bit of a push to the right, pitched around 90 yards, so just a smooth wedge there. So club head speed dropped down to 80, the attack angle went down to 5.5 degrees downwards. The swing path there is similar, around 4 degrees. You can see contact maybe just slightly out of the toe. So first up guys, let's talk about the setup position, why we're seeing a difference there in that club data. First up guys, I think the biggest difference really, we're going to take a look at the whole swing in a second, but would be at setup. Now I use the grid system here, the stack and tilt grid system, and I've talked about this a lot. Now the ball position is kind of a variable, right? These positions aren't necessarily set in stone, but these are guidelines, right? This grid here, I might play the ball a bit further up or back on the grid compared to someone else, depending on that person's individual swing. So we use these as a guideline. Now we've talked a lot about the center point of the swing, which is this point here where my left heel goes or my left shoulder goes. Now for both of those ball positions, I've got them up on the screen here. Now just taking a look at the difference there between them. First of all, you can see that the ball is pretty much on the same position on the grid. So I've put it on this back tee claw now. If I was to put a number on that, if the 0 point is the left shoulder, I would say I'm 1, 2, 3 balls behind the left shoulder with the ball position for both of those clubs. Now the difference being, when you take a look at the width of stance first of all, you can see that with the wedge there, I'm standing a lot narrower. And when I stand a lot narrower, you can see that that ball position in relationship to my feet looks a little bit further back. And I think this is where a lot of people get confused when they're using the grid or they're working out the ball position for them with the different clubs, is that by standing narrower, that moves my left shoulder a bit more forward, and that moves that attack angle, the swing path, maybe a fraction more inside. Now the wider I go, my left shoulder does pull back slightly. The ball position appears a lot further forward in my stance, but from my left heel, it's not really a difference. It's just the fact that just with that wider stance there, it does move my left shoulder a little bit closer to the ball. And that's why we saw a slight difference in the attack angle. We saw I was around 4 degrees downwards with the 7-iron and around 5.5 degrees downwards with the wedge. Now, when you take a look at the best players in the world, very similar sort of stats. You look around with a 7-iron, it's going to be around 4.5 degrees downwards for the best players in the world, and then just over 5 degrees downwards with a wedge. So very similar to that, and that's kind of where the stack and tilt system kind of evolves from. We're trying to teach you guys what the best players in the world do. So by setting up, by having my feet narrower, I know my left shoulder is going to be more forward. I know my attack angle is going to be more downwards. I don't need to start using my feet as a guide for ball position. I find that by using the grid system, like I said, this is 3 balls behind that left shoulder. this gives me a consistent position. I just need to change the width of my stance. And I think that's, first of all, guys, really important key note there is to use your left heel or your left shoulder as the guide for ball position, because some players will have different width stance, right? So someone's middle position could be different to someone else's middle position depending on how wide they stand. So that's the system I use, and I think that that's the best way for me to guide and be consistent with my ball position, just using my left shoulder and width of stance there to change it. And if you were to go further forward into detail in this video, then again, with the wider stance going into maybe a 5-4, even a 3-iron, then that ball again gets closer to the left shoulder as you widen your stance. And last week we talked a little bit about differences between the 7-iron and the driver, and again, that was a big difference from that left shoulder. So I think that's the key one there, guys. You've got to get that set-up position with the width of the stance and a consistent distance behind that left shoulder. Using the grid is going to help you be more consistent at setup and help you deliver that attack angle much better into the golf ball. Just taking a look at the side view here from the setup position, you can see that with the wedge there on the right hand side that I'm probably bending a little bit more forward. I think the key note is here that the clubs are different lengths and the hand position is very similar. It's just that I'm standing a little bit closer. You can see where my feet are in terms of those grid lines. So you can see that I do stand a little bit closer with the wedge just to accommodate that length of club. So important note there, guys, really my hands are in a similar position. I'm just standing a little bit closer and bending more forward when I use the wedge. Let's now take a look at the swing, because I think the key differences are mainly at setup, but let's have a look at the swing. There's a few differences here. So I'm just going to play the two swings out. You can see I've got the line there on the right leg and a circle around the head. And just looking at the backswing there, you can see that actually when you take a look at the body position, there's not a lot of differences there. I think you can see that just my shoulders have just turned a little bit more with the 7-iron on that left-hand side. My left arm has just traveled a little bit further as well. So if you take a look at the motion numbers there, you can see that I have got a little bit more rotation, around 4 degrees more with my shoulders, around 6 degrees more with my hips. So the big difference there would really be the amount I rotate and how much that left arm travels, but it's not a big difference there between the 7-iron and the wedge. So we take a look at the downswing here. So similar backswing, just that longer swing with the 7-iron. Now as I start down, very similar body movement. You can see my lower body weight starting to move left, my head staying centered, hands forward at impact, turning, extending, pushing my hips forward in the finish. So very similar kind of movements in the downswing. So when you look at the relationship between the circle on the head, the line on the leg, and between these two swings as a whole, there's not a big difference. So I think the main difference there is really at setup. I think when you take a look at the swing there, the movements are very similar. And I think that's quite important to note, guys, that I'm not really changing a lot between these two clubs. I just set up slightly differently, and in my swing I just create a little bit more speed and power. We saw about 10 miles an hour extra speed with the 7-iron, partly down to having a longer club, but also I do have a slightly longer swing. You can see there's more rotation in the backswing, and actually when you look at the follow through, slightly more rotation there on the left with the 7-iron. As you can see there, golf, there's not a huge difference between these two clubs in the swing, just the main difference there at setup, which is kind of what we saw last week when we compared the 7-iron to the driver using the stack and tilt system. So thanks for watching, golfers. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. In the meantime, make sure you stay on the grid, and I'll see you again next week for another video.